What's going on, everybody? This is robwillis.info here, and this video is actually going to be part 2 of setting up the ELK stack on Ubuntu 16.04. So just to recap part 1 real quick, I covered some of the basics of how the ELK stack works and the basics of how it's configured, and then also went into installing and configuring Ubuntu 16.04. So the steps completed on the VM so far were we installed the base OS, and I'm using the desktop version here, but the steps should be the same on the server version. I've configured in a static IP address. I've also installed and configured SSH, and I've updated the OS with all of the latest packages. Alright, so now that we got that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with setting up the Elastic packages. So this is the same VM that I set up in the last video, but I went ahead and changed the wallpaper and whatnot a little bit, just kind of tweak some of the settings a little bit to make it look a little bit prettier and cleaner. Alright, so let me just get logged in here real quick, and today we're mainly going to be working with the terminal, but I also have a little cheat sheet that I saved down locally that has all the commands in, so I can just copy and paste them real quick rather than typing them out and making the video drag. But I'll be publishing all that on my blog, and I'll also be publishing the config files there too, and you'll be able to find links to all that stuff down below. Alright, so I'm just going to go ahead and pull up my cheat sheet, and let's get started here. So the first thing we're going to want to do is go ahead and add the repositories for all the packages that we want to install. So up first I'll do the Elastic repo, and first we're going to add the Elastic key, and then we'll add the Elastic repo to the distribution. And the nice thing about this is it's going to make it a lot easier to install the packages because we can just apt-get them, and then it also makes it easy to keep them updated as well. And we see that the command ran successfully, and now I'm just going to copy the next command, which this one's going to be the one that actually adds the repository to the distribution, and it also ran successfully. And again, all the stuff's going to be available on my website, so you can just easily copy and paste these, and you can see them nice and clear. And so the next thing we're going to do is add the Java repository, because we actually need Java for Elasticsearch and for Logstash. And this one's done by just doing a sudo add apt repository and specifying the Java repository. And once that completes, I'm going to do a sudo apt get update so we can pull down all the new information and packages that are available from the repositories that we just added. Alright, so now that that's complete, I'm going to go ahead and clear the screen and then copy this command to install the Java 8. So it's just a sudo apt-get yes to install the Oracle Java 8 installer, and that's it. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and I'm going to skip through some of this because it takes a second, but it's a super straightforward command, and I'm just going to hit OK to continue with the install, accept the EULA, and let it go. Alright, so we see that Java is successfully installed at this point, and now the next thing we want to do is go ahead and create a SSL certificate, because later on we're going to be using Nginx as a proxy to sit in front of Kibana, and we're going to be using that to establish an HTTPS connection, and for that we're going to need an SSL certificate. So I'm just going to go ahead and create two directories. One's going to be called certs and one's going to be called private, and they're going to be in etc pki tls. And one folder is going to be for the certificates themselves, and then the other folder will be, the private one will be for the private keys for the certificates. Okay, so now with both of those directories made, we can go ahead and actually, before I actually create the certificate, I'm going to be tying my certificate to the IP address of the server rather than a DNS name. So I actually have to modify the OpenSSL configuration file a little bit to allow for this. So I'm just going to sudo nano and open the file at etcssl in the openssl.cnf configuration file, and I'm going to add the following line that basically specifies subject alternative name, and it's the IP address of the server itself. So just bear with me for a second while I find the section that this has to be added to, which is going to be designated by the v3_ca tag, and we see it there. So I'm just going to add, it's going to be subject alt name equals IP colon and then the IP address of our server. And you just want to make sure that you tie that portion right there to the IP address that's set to your local server, and then you should be good to go. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit Control X to exit out of here and confirm that I want to save the file. Alright, so now that we got that saved, I'm just going to go ahead and change directory to where we created those folders earlier. So I'm going to cd to etc pki tls, and you see that it now shows that we're working in that directory. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this command that I have over here, which is basically just a sudo openSSL, and it specifies the configuration file that we just edited, and says to create a X509 certificate valid for 10 years, create a new RSA key of 4096 bit strength, and it also specifies the key out file along with the certificate file name. So this should create the certificate and the key file that we need later on for the Nginx configuration, and it's going to do this in the certs folder that we made in the private folder. And that's pretty much it. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit enter and let it generate the certificate. And there we go. It's already completed. Alright, so at this point we've gone ahead and added the necessary repositories to our distribution, installed Java 8, and we've also gone ahead and created the SSL certificate that we're going to need for our configuration later on. So we're basically ready to go ahead and proceed with installing the Elastic packages. So the first package I'm going to install is going to be Elasticsearch. So I'm just going to cd out of the certificate directory real quick and then clear the screen. And then I'm going to copy this command over here. And since we added the repos to the distribution, it's as easy as sudo apt-get install Elasticsearch. And I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit because it's going to take a minute to install, and then I'll pick up once it's completed. Alright, so now that that's completed, I'm just going to go ahead and pull up the configuration file by doing sudo nano, and it's going to be etc elasticsearch and then elasticsearch.yml. And I just want to uncomment one line in this configuration file that's going to lock access down to the localhost and the localhost only. But the line I'm looking for is network.host : and then localhost. So I'm just going to scroll down here a little bit, and we see it there. So I'm just going to uncomment it, and I'm actually going to change the IP address to just localhost. Oop, I lost my place there. So yeah, I'm just going to change that 192.168 to just localhost, and that'll restrict access to the localhost only. You do have to watch your spacing with these kind of configuration files in the YAML format, but I'm just going to Control X out and then go ahead and confirm that I want to save the file as what it was. And since we made changes to the configuration file, we're going to go ahead and need to restart the service. So I'm just going to do a sudo service Elasticsearch and restart to restart the service. And then hit enter, and then I'm going to do a sudo systemctl enable Elasticsearch, and this will ensure that Elasticsearch starts every time the server reboots, and it just starts with the system. And that's it. At this point, Elasticsearch should be up and running. So I'm just going to wget against the localhost on port 9200 real quick, because that's the default port that Elastic runs on. And we see that it returns a 200 OK and pulls down an index.html file. So I'm just going to go ahead and cat the result of that index.html file. And we see that it returns some basic information about our cluster along with the tagline, for search. So we know at this point that the Elasticsearch service is up and running and configured correctly. Now we can go ahead and move on to installing Kibana. So the install is going to be similar to Elasticsearch. I'm just going to do a sudo apt-get install Kibana. And the install is going to take a second, so I'm going to skip forward a little bit and I'll pick up once it's completed. Alright, so now that that's completed, we want to pull up the configuration file, and I'm just going to do a sudo nano, and it's going to be located at etc Kibana, kibana.yml. And we're going to do the same thing like we did with Elasticsearch. We're going to lock it down to the localhost and the localhost only. So we're looking to uncomment this line right here, the server.host : and we're just going to leave the default setting of localhost. Alright, and then I'll just do a Control X to exit out and confirm that I want to save the file. And since we made changes to the configuration file, we want to go ahead and make sure we restart the service. So I'm just going to do a sudo service Kibana restart. And I also want to make sure that it starts up with the server each time it reboots. So I'm just going to do sudo systemctl enable Kibana. And that's it. So Kibana should be successfully installed and up and running at this point. So we can just go ahead and verify that it's running by browsing to localhost and specifying the port 5601. So let's pull up Firefox and see what we get. And we see that it does actually successfully load Kibana. So we know at this point that Kibana is successfully installed and it's actually up and running. but it doesn't have any sort of user authentication in front of it. So that's where Nginx is going to come in for us. We're actually going to use that to establish an HTTPS connection and then do the basic authentication. So let's go ahead and get started with the Nginx configuration now. So with the Nginx install, I'm just going to do a basic sudo apt-get install Nginx, but I'm also going to include an additional package that's going to be apache 2-utils. And that package is going to help create the users that we're going to use with the basic authentication later on. So these packages are going to take a second to install, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and I'll pick back up when they've completed. Alright, so now that the packages have installed, now I gotta go ahead and create my user for the basic authentication. So I'm just gonna do a sudo htpassword -c and specify my configuration file, which is gonna be etc nginx htpassword.users, and then where at the end I had Kibana admin there, I'm gonna do rob, and that's gonna be the username of the user that I'm creating. And then it's gonna prompt me to create a password for this user. Alright, so now we need to prepare the Nginx configuration file. So I'm just going to clear the screen real quick, and then, so the first thing we need to do is wipe the configuration file clean. So I'm just going to do a sudo truncate-s0, and the file is going to be located at etc nginx sites-available in default. And I'm just going to hit enter to go ahead and wipe that configuration file to just blank. And now I'm just going to do a sudo nano and open that configuration file, and again it's located at etc nginx sites available, and it's the default configuration file. But when we open the file we should see that it's blank, and it is blank. And so I'm just going to go ahead and copy my configuration that I have over here and paste it into the default config. And so just a quick run through the config. It's saying listen on port 80 on the IP address of the server, the 192.168.285. And if anything hits it on port 80, redirect it to HTTPS immediately. And then the second part of the config file says listen on port 443, use the certificate and the key file that we created earlier. And you see that's those paths that we used. And then next up we're going to define where the basic authentication is. And we see that we're basically just pointing to the htpassword.users file that we created earlier. And then the last bit of it is the reverse proxy part, where it points to the Kibana instance. And you see here we have the localhost on port 5601 defined. And that's so that we can hit it on the IP address, and it's going to point us to the Kibana instance and pull the data through for us. So anybody can hit it on the IP address at that point. We don't have to hit it from the localhost. So I'm just going to paste that configuration into there, and then Control X and save that file, and that's it. So now, since we made changes to the configuration file, I'm going to go ahead and sudo service nginx and restart it. And then I'm also going to sudo systemctl enable nginx to make sure that nginx starts with the system. Okay, so if we did everything correctly at this point, we should be able to hit Kibana by browsing to the IP address of the server, and it should redirect to HTTPS, and it should prompt us to log in before presenting any of the Kibana interface. So I'm just going to type in the IP address of the server here, and we see that it did switch to HTTPS, and it gives us a warning about the certificate that we used, but that's expected because it's a self-signed certificate. But I'm just going to go ahead and go up and confirm a security exception. Now you could purchase a certificate and you wouldn't get this error, but in this case, since it's self-signed, we're just going to go ahead and confirm the exception. And then I'm going to use the user that I created earlier, and I'm just going to click OK. And we see that it successfully logs us into the Kibana interface. And notice that we didn't have to specify the port of 5601 or anything like that. And that's because the Nginx is handling all of that for us. But at this point we see that we've got Kibana set up with Nginx in front of it. We've got our basic authentication, our HTTPS connection. And now we just got to get Logstash set up and get some data flowing into our instance. And for the Logstash install, we're just going to do a sudo apt-get install Logstash. And the install is going to take a second, so I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead a little bit, and I'll pick back up once it's completed. Alright, so now that we got Logstash installed, we need to build a few of the configuration files. So the first one I'm going to do is going to be, I'm going to run sudo nano, and I'm going to create the file in etc logstash conf.d, and I'm going to name the file o2-beads-input.conf. And this is going to be my Beats input listener. So when I configure remote clients later on with the Beats agents, this is going to be the listener for it. But the config file is just going to say input Beats port 5044, and that's going to be the listener port for my Beats agents to send their data to. And I'm just going to hit Control X and confirm that I want to save the file. And that's it. And so the next configuration file that I'm going to make is going to be my syslog filter. And I'm just going to sudo nano, same location, etc logstash conf.d. And this one's going to be named 10-syslog-filter.conf. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this configuration there. And this is going to be my default filter for syslog logs. And I'm just going to hit Control X to save the configuration file and confirm yes. And save the file. And then the last file I'm going to make is going to be my Elasticsearch output configuration file. And I'm just going to do sudo nano, same location, etc logstash conf.d. And I'm going to name this one 30-elasticsearch-output.conf. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste my configuration here. And this configuration is basically going to say send the output to Elasticsearch located at localhost on port 9200. And that's pretty much all we really need in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit Control X and then confirm that I want to save the file. And since we made changes to the configuration, we're going to go ahead and need to restart the service. So I'm just going to sudo service logstash restart. And then we want to make sure that it starts with the system. So I'm going to sudo systemctl enable logstash. And then lastly, let's check to make sure that the service is still running after configuration changes. So systemctl status logstash, and we see that it is still running. And so we should be good to go there. At this point, the ELK stack is completely up and running, and it's ready to receive data. Alright, so at this point we got all the ELK services up and running, but it doesn't seem like we can do very much in Kibana. If you click on it and we go to it, you'll see that it just keeps barking about we don't have a default index pattern created. But it won't let you create one either, and that's because there's no data being sent to it. So what we need to do is we need to use something like one of the Beats agents to send some data to our Logstash so that it can be indexed by Elastic, and then we can search it in Kibana. So let's go ahead and install Filebeat on our local ELK server. And I'm just going to do a sudo apt-get install and Filebeat. And I'm just going to skip ahead to once it's completed installing. Alright, so now that Filebeat's installed, let's go ahead and pull up its configuration file. And I'm just going to sudo nano, and it's going to be etc filebeat filebeat.yml. And again, it's going to be in that YAML configuration format, so we need to watch our spacing here. But we need to find the section that's input type, and we see the log there. And then we see that it has some paths for where we can define what logs we want to ingest into our Logstash instance. So I'm just going to use var log, and I'm going to take the auth.log, and then I'm also going to do var log and syslog. And I'm just going to add those into my configuration file here, and then save and confirm the changes. And just like everything else, since we made changes to the configuration, I'm going to go ahead and restart the service. So I'll just sudo service filebeat restart. And then I want to make sure that it also starts with the system. So I'm going to sudo systemctl enable Filebeat. So the default configuration of Filebeat should be to send the data directly to Elasticsearch, which in this case it will actually work because it's Filebeat sending it to the local host, and we have it configured to listen on localhost. So we should be able to add the index pattern at this point. So I'm just going to go ahead and do Filebeat-wildcard, which should be for the date there. And once we pick the time field name, I'm just going to use @timestamp. We see that we're then able to create a index pattern, as the button is now no longer grayed out. And I'm going to go ahead and click create, and we see that it already populates some of the fields that are going to be available from our logs. Now, as you add additional logs and filters, you may have to actually come back here and refresh the pattern so it picks up the new fields that you've added. So that's just something worth noting. But let's go to the Discover tab and take a look and see what we can find. So we see that we have Filebeat selected as our index pattern, and we're searching within the last 15 minutes. But we do see that logs are flowing into our Elastic instance, so we're able to search them. And that's pretty much it. So I think that's where I'm going to wrap part 2. At this point, we've got the ELK stack completely up and running on Ubuntu 16.04, and we've got it receiving data from itself, and we're able to search and view that data in the Kibana instance. So make sure you check out part 3 in this series, where I'll be setting up the Beats agents on a remote Windows 2012 R2 server, and I'll be collecting the Windows event logs as well as the IIS logs through Filebeat. If you liked the video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, and if you really liked the video, make sure you give me a subscribe if you haven't already. As always, thanks for watching.